Hey, welcome to our next lesson. Today we're going back to the future and looking at kairos, context, and time, and how they play a role in rhetoric and specifically in regard to rhetorical situations. To do so, we'll look at Lloyd Bitzer's article, The Rhetorical Situation. Today's keywords are audience, constraints, context, exigence, rhetorical situation, and temporality. So we keep coming back to kairos, don't we? Nietzsche might have called this a minor manifestation of eternal recurrence, but we can also just consider it a question of constancy. Great minds think alike, the more things change, the more they stay the same, etc., etc. As our previous readings have shown, even those who disagree with each other in terms of approach agree that the right words for the right place, delivered at the right time, are a big part of preparing a rhetorical argument. We're reading the room, and they can be very successful or they can lead to failure. We're figuring out the rhetorical situation. So, The Rhetorical Situation is a heavily influential article published by Lloyd Bitzer in 1968, and it appeared in the journal Communication and Mass Media Complete. Bitzer was born in Ohio, received his doctorate at the University of Iowa after some time as a philosophy student at UNC, and worked at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from the 1960s until he retired in 1994. The rhetorical situation can be thought of as something you might know about, but never quite know the term for until you learn it. I think we can all look at our lives and draw one or two conclusions as to a situation wherein the wrong word was said at the wrong time, or the situation or the approach of a speaker felt off. Here's my big example. Once I was at a sleepover camp when I was young. They had a big final event night where all the staff came out and did dumb skits, etc., etc. I think we were all 10 or something like that. It was elementary school age. And by the end of that week, you're tired, you don't like where you are, you're around all these people you don't know. It's just awkward. So you may be a little emotional. So what happened on that last night in our cabin? All of us started crying, just sobbing hysterically. Looking back on it, it's upsetting to think about. It was a really uncomfortable situation. But again, the staff, who were kind of horribly uninterested about everything and just there to collect a check, well, one of them was our group supervisor. And he was an older guy, and he came to our door and just started scolding us, telling us to calm down, stop making so much noise, pointing fingers, and being really intimidating in that angry vice principal way, telling us we were bad, whatever have you. But here's the thing, he was still in his costume for the skit, and he was dressed as a clown. I mean, a literal clown. Even at that time, I was like, dude, you're dressed as a clown and scolding me for being emotional. This isn't the movie It. I cannot take you seriously. I can't tell you how odd it is to be dressed down for not being responsible, as a 10-year-old, by a grown man who's literally wearing a clown costume. It was funny then, and it's funny now. Why? Because it was not a fitting response to the rhetorical situation. I doubt that clown guy appreciates me telling the story, but I've sat on it for 25 years, and I still think it's funny that he decided screaming at me while dressed as a clown was going to be effective. He'll get over it. Kairos. It matters. A working definition of the term rhetorical situation can be found on page 6 of the reading. The rhetorical situation may be defined as a complex of persons, events, objects, and relations presenting an actual or potential exigence, which can be completely or partially removed if discourse, introduced into the situation, can so constrain human decision or action as to bring about the significant modification of the exigence. The rhetorical situation is made up of 3 parts: exigence, audience, and constraints. So let's define them. Exigence can be interpreted as the existence of a problem. Sometimes it can be rhetorical, and sometimes it isn't rhetorical. As per page 6, quote, any exigence is an imperfection marked by urgency. It is a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be. In almost any sort of context, there will be numerous exigences, but not all are rhetorical exigences. So, what counts as a rhetorical exigence? According to Bitzer, from page 7, quote, an exigence is rhetorical if it is capable of positive modification, and when positive modification requires discourse, or can be assisted by discourse. On that same page, Bitzer cites air pollution as an example, saying, the pollution of our air is also a rhetorical exigence because its positive modification, reduction of pollution, strongly invites the assistance of discourse producing public awareness, indignation, and action of the right kind. Alright, so you have that, and an audience is, well, an audience. People being spoken to or addressed. Our discourse, meaning what we say, do, write, etc., can be influential on an audience. Bitzer claims rhetoric always requires an audience, noting, quote, "A rhetorical audience consists only of those persons who are capable of being influenced by discourse and of being mediators of change." He also writes that the rhetorical audience must be capable of serving as mediator of the change which the discourse functions to produce. So, you see audience here having a specific actual function, and having to be in a certain position to function in that way. And this is a good time to ask question 1. What types of discourse do not require an audience according to Bitzer? Why does he believe that to be the case? Do you agree or disagree? Explain why or why not. This brings us to constraints. Constraints are the events, relationships, and people which place limits on actions, decisions, or approaches. You'll note that people here can actually be a constraint as well as make up an audience. So there's an interrelation going on. We can relate these to Aristotle's proofs when we think about a speaker's ethos, logos, or pathos. But constraints should not be interpreted only as limits. They can be both limitations and opportunities, physical as well as psychological. For Bitzer, rhetoric comes into existence and is given significance as a response to a situation. A rhetorical situation may decay without a response, however. For instance, if we look at the recent protests, could we take their intensification as an example of a rhetorical situation decaying due to a lack of response? That's a very different set of circumstances than, say, asking for UNC to teach its classes in a certain way due to COVID, but both are valid things to look at as far as the rhetorical situation goes. Question 2. How could you view the COVID-19 pandemic as a rhetorical situation? What are the exigencies, constraints, and audience concerns related to the pandemic? Feel free to think about and write about your own particular situation in terms of these events. For Bitzer, there has to be a, quote, fitting response if it is to address the rhetorical situation in a satisfactory manner. The response must fit the situation because the situation dictates that response. A situation which is strong and clear dictates the purpose, theme, matter, and style of the response. A fitting response, however, should not be interpreted as a successful response as a matter of course, but it is fitting if it addresses the factors that define the situation. A response is fitting if the audience is interested and capable of mediating change, or if the audience is not interested but is capable of mediating change, and if they can be influenced to be interested. If the audience is interested but not capable of mediating change at the moment, but if the audience can mitigate change in the future, then that's fine too. But a response is not fitting if the audience is not interested and cannot mediate change. There's a really good quote from page 11 here that's quite useful. One might say metaphorically that every situation prescribes its fitting response. The rhetor may or may not read the prescription accurately. By the way, the term prescription kind of gets us back to Gorgias and Kairos and seductive drug talk with regard to speech, right? Bit of a tangent, but it's related. One thing to pay attention to here is not only the context, the nature of the situation, the factors involved, but also the temporal factors. What's the timing like? What is happening that's in, around, and relevant to the situation at hand? Rhetorical situations can be imagined as situations which mature, deteriorate, and change. Seizing on the kairos so as to offer the best response at the best time and in the best way is key. The time component and the timing component should always be accounted for when we analyze a rhetorical situation. So with that in mind, think over the video of Bush's 9/11 speech, perhaps one of the most interesting examples of a unique rhetorical situation we've seen in our lifetimes, and answer the following questions. Okay, so this is a much larger question, and this is a much more involved question, but the lesson today is much shorter, so you've got the time to devote to it. In terms of the rhetorical situation, what challenges was Bush facing? Who was his audience, and moreover, who was not his audience? What exigencies were he and his audience facing? And what constraints did he have to account for? Again, that's a big, tough question, but it should be helpful for you as you start thinking about longer responses, and we have our first assignment coming up next week, so this should be a really valuable thing to think about. I want to point out how recurrent rhetorical situations tend to give rise to similar rhetorical responses. These similar responses are often grouped together as a genre, and genres create expectations on the part of an audience. They are, among other things, something we could consider to be constraints in a rhetorical situation. Tomorrow we'll discuss the genre. I'll see you online during office hours, and be sure to check in with me if you haven't, and as always, reach out with any questions. Thanks a lot, take care.